Truman Capote looked at America and saw a party. Joan Didion looked at the same country and saw a crime scene. For 5 decades, this tiny, fragile woman in oversized sunglasses served as the designated mourner for the American dream, coolly dissecting the chaos of the 1960s, the paranoia of the 70s, and the emptiness of Hollywood. She was the expert on entropy, the writer who famously warned us that the center cannot hold. But the ultimate tragedy of Joan Didion's life was not that she foresaw the collapse of the culture, but that she could not predict the collapse of her own world. How did the woman who built her fortress out of perfect sentences survive the unthinkable year when silence finally won, losing her husband and her daughter in a span of months, leaving her the sole survivor of her own life? This is not just the story of a writer who watched the world fall apart. It is the autopsy of a woman who had to keep writing while she was being buried alive by grief. Let's decode Joan Didion. We must dig into the hard, unforgiving soil of Sacramento. We must go back to the geography that birthed her, because Joan Didion was not just born in a place. She was formed by a landscape. She was a child of the Central Valley, a flat, burning expanse of California that has nothing to do with the Beach Boys or the Hollywood sign. Born in 1934, in the depths of the Great Depression, she entered a world that was already looking backward. Her family did not just live in Sacramento. They were the aristocracy of the dust. They were descendants of the pioneers, the people who had crossed the plains in covered wagons, pushing westward with a grim determination that bordered on madness. But there was a darkness in this lineage that set the tone for Didion's entire psychological makeup. Her ancestors traveled with the Donner Party, the infamous expedition that became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains in 1846 and resorted to cannibalism to survive the winter. Didion's direct ancestors had the sheer dumb luck, or perhaps the intuitive paranoia, to split off from the main group just before the disaster. They took the Oregon Trail while the others took the fatal shortcut. This near miss with historical horror was the lullaby of Didion's childhood. She was raised on the specific, terrifying mythology of the frontier, that survival is a matter of luck and ruthlessness. She learned that life is a series of cuts. You cut your losses. You throw the piano off the wagon to save the oxen. You leave the weak behind to save the strong. This was not a sentimental heritage. It was a lesson in the fragility of civilization. Growing up, she walked through cemeteries where the tombstones bore the names of her relatives, people who had died of fever, of snake bite, of sheer exhaustion. She understood from the age of 5 that the difference between life and death was often just a matter of taking the wrong turn at a fork in the road. Consequently, she was a nervous child. How could she not be? She looked at the world and saw it for what it was, a thin veneer of order imposed on a savage wilderness. She was small, pale, and seemingly breakable. A girl who looked like a strong wind might blow her away. But this physical fragility hid a mind of terrifying rigidity. She began to hear the world before she saw it. She was obsessed with the rhythm of speech, the cadence of the conversation at the dinner table. She noticed the gaps, the things people didn't say, the polite euphemisms they used to cover up the terror of existence. It was during these sweltering Sacramento summers, when the temperature would linger at 100 degrees for weeks, that she found her weapon, the sentence. She realized that she couldn't control the heat, she couldn't control the flooding rivers, and she couldn't control the snakes that lived under the porch. But she could control language. If she could arrange words in the right order, if she could place the commas and the semicolons with the precision of an engineer, she could create a barrier against the chaos. There's a famous image of the young Joan Didion sitting in her bedroom, typing out the stories of Ernest Hemingway. She wasn't copying them to plagiarize. She was typing them to feel the anatomy of the prose. She wanted to understand how the sentences worked, how the rhythm created the emotion. She learned the economy of the blade, that what you leave out is more important than what you put in. She learned that a short declarative sentence could hit harder than a paragraph of flowery description. While other girls were playing with dolls, Joan Didion was dissecting the syntax of masculinity, learning how to write like a man who had seen war, so that she could survive the war she felt was coming. This obsession with structure became her religion. In a world without God, or at least without a benevolent God, grammar was the only liturgy that made sense. It was the only way to impose order on the messiness of human emotion. But Sacramento, for all its grim history, was too small a container for her intellect. She was a changeling, a creature who didn't quite fit the pioneer mold. She was too observant, too critical, too neurasthenic, as the doctors of the time might have said. She needed a bigger stage to dissect. In the mid-1950s, the escape hatch opened. She won a writing contest sponsored by Vogue magazine, the Prix de Paris. The prize was a job in Paris or New York. She chose New York. It was the classic pilgrimage of the American writer, the flight from the provincial to the metropolis. But when Didion arrived in Manhattan in 1956, she didn't arrive as a conqueror. She arrived as an observer, a tiny figure in a rain slicker standing on the corner of Madison Avenue, watching the machinery of the publishing world grind into motion. The Vogue years are often misunderstood in the biography of Joan Didion. People assume that working at a fashion magazine was a frivolous detour for a serious writer. They are wrong. Vogue was her boot camp. It was the place where the steel was tempered. The Vogue of the 1950s was not just a magazine. It was a finishing school for a specific kind of terrifying excellence. It was run by women like Aline Talmy, editors who were as ruthless about adjectives as a surgeon is about gangrene. Didion was assigned to the merchandising department, writing captions. It sounds lowly, but it was a masterclass in compression. She was forced to describe a photograph, a mood, a fabric, and a lifestyle in 50 words or less. She was told to never use the word imagination. She was told to cut. Every word cost money. Every comma had to justify its existence. This training stripped her prose of any lingering sentimentality. It taught her to write with a scalpel. She learned to look at a photograph of a woman in a ball gown and see not just the dress, but the tension in the hand, the anxiety in the eyes, the social context of the room. She learned the dirty eye of the caption writer, the ability to summarize a world in a single biting phrase. And she was living the life that every young girl in America dreamed of. She was a Vogue girl. She went to the parties. She wore the clothes. She floated through the cocktail hours of the late 50s, a time of martinis and beige propriety. But while she was physically present in the high society of New York, spiritually, she was alienated. She felt like a fraud. She would sit at her desk at 420 Lexington Avenue, typing copy about the new yellow, while her mind drifted back to the Sacramento rivers, to the heat, to the idea that this urban sophistication was just a temporary distraction. She wrote her first novel, Run River, during these years. It was a love letter to the California she had left behind, but a dark love letter. It was a book about the disintegration of a marriage and a way of life. She was typing it at night, after the Vogue parties, trying to capture the specific melancholy of the hops fields and the levees. She was homesick, not for her family, but for the clarity of the West. New York felt cluttered to her. It felt soft. The West was hard, and she missed the hardness. It was in this state of high-functioning alienation that she met the person who would become the other half of her brain, John Gregory Dunne. He was an Irish Catholic writer, gregarious, loud, a connector, a man who loved the noise of the world. Didion was the silence. Dunne was the sound. They met in the incestuous literary circles of New York, and the attraction was immediate and intellectual. They were not just lovers, they were co-conspirators. They recognized in each other a shared cynicism, a shared obsession with the mechanics of storytelling. They became a two-headed creature, editing each other's work, finishing each other's sentences. Dunne gave Didion the protection she needed to operate in the world. He was the buffer between her fragility and the brutality of the industry. But by 1964, the romance of New York had worn thin. The city was changing. The crisp, clear lines of the 50s were blurring into something messier. Didion felt the shift in the atmospheric pressure. She was crying in elevators. She was suffering from vertigo. The nervousness of her childhood had returned, amplified by the claustrophobia of the city. She famously wrote, "It is easy to see the beginnings of things, and harder to see the ends." She saw the end of her New York era coming. She realized that she could not stay at the fair forever. When they landed in Los Angeles, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and impending doom. The Santa Ana winds were blowing. The 1960s were about to explode, and Joan Didion had just arrived at ground zero with a notebook in her purse. She was about to witness the moment when the American dream curdled into a hallucination. The Gold Coast was waiting for her, but she wasn't looking for the gold. She was looking for the fault lines. Leaving New York for Los Angeles was not merely a change of address. It was a shift in gravitational pull. They traded the vertical claustrophobia of Manhattan for the horizontal agoraphobia of the West, swapping the cocktail party for the freeway. Didion wasn't returning to the safe pioneer Sacramento of her childhood. She was driving straight into a new electric wilderness. The timing was impeccable. The tectonic plates of American culture were about to shift, and the epicenter was not in the newsrooms of the East Coast, but in the canyons of California. As the Stingray hit the tarmac, the 1950s were officially over, and the hallucination was about to begin. The Los Angeles that Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne drove into in 1964 was not a city. It was a nervous system stretched to the breaking point. To the casual observer, it looked like paradise, a sprawling grid of palm trees, swimming pools, and endless sunshine. But Didion did not see the paradise. She felt the vibration. She sensed that beneath the asphalt of the freeways, the tectonic plates were grinding against each other, both geologically and culturally. The 1960s were entering their terminal phase, the moment when the bright, acidic optimism of the early decade was beginning to curdle into paranoia, and Didion had positioned herself exactly where the earthquake would hit hardest. They settled into a large crumbling house at 7406 Franklin Avenue in Hollywood. This house would become legendary in the annals of American cultural history. It was not just a home, it was a checkpoint. It was a secular temple, where the old Hollywood of fading movie stars met the new Hollywood of young directors, rock musicians, and drifters. It was a place where you might find a Black Panther eating dinner next to a studio executive, or Janis Joplin drinking bourbon on the couch, while a Pulitzer Prize winner argued in the kitchen. But amidst this carnival of personalities, Didion remained the ghost in her own machine. Her physical slightness became part of her legend, but it was her stillness, the way she absorbed a room without filling it, that truly unnerved people. She spoke softly, if she spoke at all. This silence was her superpower. In a town built on noise and ego, her quietness was magnetic. People projected their own anxieties onto her. They looked at this frail woman with the large, dark glasses and felt a strange compulsion to confess. They told her things they wouldn't tell a priest or a therapist. They told her about the bad drug trips, the failing marriages, the creeping sense that the world was ending. And Didion listened. She took notes, sometimes on a notepad, but mostly in the steel trap of her mind. She was the recording angel of the apocalypse. It was during these years that she began to write the essays that would form her masterpiece, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. The title itself was a warning shot taken from W.B. Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. While other journalists were writing puff pieces about the summer of love and the liberation of the youth, Didion looked at the counterculture and saw a void. She didn't see a revolution. She saw a breakdown. In 1967, she went to San Francisco to report on the Haight-Ashbury district, the supposed mecca of the hippie movement. A lesser writer would have focused on the flowers, the music, the idealism. Didion focused on the debris. She walked through the Golden Gate Park and didn't see utopia. She saw lost children. She saw runaways with no political consciousness, floating in a vacuum of drugs and vague slogans. She saw a generation that had cut itself loose from history, from family, from language itself. The centerpiece of her reporting was a scene that remains one of the most chilling in American journalism. She walked into a derelict house and found a 5-year-old girl named Susan. Susan was wearing a white kindergarten dress. She was reading a comic book, and she was high on acid and peyote. Didion didn't scream. She didn't call the police. She didn't moralize. She simply wrote it down. She described the scene with the cold clinical detachment of a coroner. By refusing to inject her own outrage into the text, she forced the reader to confront the horror directly. It was a moment that shattered the myth of the 60s. It wasn't peace and love. It was child abuse masquerading as freedom. It was the high kindergarten. This was the genius of Didion's new journalism. Unlike Tom Wolfe or Norman Mailer, who inserted their own egos into the story, turning themselves into characters, Didion made herself transparent. She was the lens, not the subject. But the lens was cracked. She admitted openly that she was not an objective observer. She was suffering from vertigo. She was paralyzed by migraines. She was afraid of the telephone. By admitting her own fragility, she became the perfect avatar for a fragile age. She wrote about the Santa Ana winds, the hot, dry winds that blow off the Mojave Desert and dry out the nerves. She described the uneasy weather, the tension that makes the suicide rate rise and the crime rate spike. She wasn't just talking about meteorology, she was talking about the moral climate of America. The wind was blowing and everyone was waiting for the match to be struck. As the decade wore on, the unease Didion had been chronicling began to manifest in reality. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in 1968 felt like inevitable plot points in a tragedy she had already foreseen. The Franklin Avenue house, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a fortress. The parties became darker. The drugs became harder. Cocaine replaced marijuana. The laughter became more manic. Didion and Dunn were working as screenwriters now, deeply embedded in the Hollywood machinery, and they watched as the studio system, the old order of control, collapsed, replaced by a chaotic new order of independent producers and auteurs. But the true end of the 1960s, the moment the decade officially died, happened on the night of August 9th, 1969. The Tate LaBianca murders committed by the Manson family were the dark singularity that sucked the entire era into a black hole. When the news broke that Sharon Tate, the beautiful pregnant actress, along with 4 others, had been brutally butchered in a house on Cielo Drive. A wave of primal terror washed over Los Angeles. This wasn't just a crime. It was a message. It was the moment the freaks, the long-haired, acid-dropping kids that the establishment had tried to understand, turned into monsters. For Didion, the Manson murders were not a surprise. They were a confirmation. She famously wrote, "Many people I know in Los Angeles believe that the 60s ended abruptly on August 9th, 1969, ended at the exact moment when word of the murders on Cielo Drive traveled like brush fire through the community. And in a sense, this is true. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled." She had warned for years that the cultural scaffolding was loosening. And by 1969, the warning no longer felt metaphorical. The fear that had once sounded neurotic now read like simple realism. While the rest of Hollywood locked their gates, bought guard dogs, and purchased firearms, Didion did something that perfectly encapsulates her bizarre, detached relationship with reality. She went to the trial. But she didn't just go to the trial. She befriended Linda Kasabian, the star witness for the prosecution, the Manson girl who had driven the car but hadn't done the killing. Didion looked at Kasabian and didn't see a monster. She saw a girl who looked like she could be a babysitter. She saw a drift of a human being, a woman with no center, just like the kids in Haight-Ashbury. In a detail that feels almost like fiction, Didion took Linda Kasabian shopping. She bought the star witness a dress to wear in court. Imagine the scene. Joan Didion, the high priestess of literary chic, and Linda Kasabian, the Manson disciple, standing in a boutique in Los Angeles, looking at him lengths. It is a moment of profound absurdity. It is practical, domestic, and utterly chilling. It suggests a refusal to look away from the horror. It suggests that even the apocalypse has a dress code. Didion understood that the trial was a performance, a narrative, and she was helping to costume the characters. She was participating in the story she was documenting. The Manson era broke something in the psyche of the West. The trust was gone. The open doors were locked. The hitchhikers were left on the side of the road. The golden dream of California had revealed its nightmare underbelly. And Didion was the one who had drawn the map of that nightmare. She had told us, page by page, that the center was not holding. Now, looking at the carnage of 1969, she didn't say, "I told you so." She simply adjusted her sunglasses, lit another cigarette, and turned the page. By the time the 1970s arrived, Joan Didion was no longer just a writer. She was a cult figure. She was the woman in the Corvette. She drove a Daytona yellow Stingray, a car that was fast, dangerous, and loud, a perfect metal shell for a woman who felt so exposed. Her image was solidified. The waif with the steel spine. She was 35 years old, but she seemed ancient, as if she had lived through several lifetimes of history in a single decade. But the body keeps the score. The psychic toll of being the designated watcher began to manifest physically. She was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in the early 1970s, though the condition later went into remission, a fact that complicates the often mythologized narrative of her fragility. The diagnosis itself, however, seemed almost too literary to be true. MS is a disease of the nervous system, a short-circuiting of the wires. For a woman whose entire career was built on sensing the short circuits in the culture, the disease felt like a physical manifestation of her work. She was vibrating at a frequency that was destroying her, yet she did not stop. She published Play It As It Lays in 1970, a novel that stripped the narrative down to its absolute bones. It is a book about a woman named Maria Wyeth, an actress whose life is dissolving into nothingness. The chapters are short, fragmented, separated by white space. It reads like a film script that has been cut to ribbons. It is a book about the nothing, the existential void that Didion saw everywhere. It was a sensation. It captured the mood of the hangover that followed the 60s party. It was the book everyone in Hollywood read and pretended to understand while secretly fearing that it was about them. As the 70s progressed, Didion and Dunn moved from the crumbling mansion on Franklin Avenue to a house in Malibu, right on the ocean. The move from the city to the edge of the continent was symbolic. She was pushing herself as far west as she could go without falling into the water. She was living on the edge of the world, watching the tide come in, waiting for the next disaster. The frantic energy of the 60s had given way to a strange, flat calm, but Didion knew that the calm was deceptive. The geology hadn't changed. The faults were still there. The fire was still burning in the hills. And she was still watching. If the 60s were a scream, the 70s arrived as a whisper, a low, menacing static that followed her from the crime scenes of Hollywood to the edge of the Pacific. The blood had been mopped up on Cielo Drive, but the stain on the American psyche remained. Didion realized that the chaos wasn't going to vanish. It was simply going to mutate. It was time to stop looking at the hippies and start looking at the hangover. Retreating to the coast, she prepared to dissect a new decade that was defined not by what was happening, but by the terrifying emptiness of what was not happening. By the mid-1970s, the fires of the counterculture had burned themselves out, leaving behind a layer of ash that covered the American landscape. The screaming psychedelic noise of the 60s had been replaced by a low, humming anxiety, the sound of a country trying to pretend that nothing had happened. In her house on the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, Joan Didion was listening to that hum. She had moved from the center of the Hollywood vortex to the edge of the continent, living in a house where the ocean tide threatened to wash the living room away at high water. It was a perfect metaphor for her mental state, a domestic fortress built on the edge of a catastrophe. It was during this period that she compiled the White Album, the book that would serve as the autopsy report for the decade she had just survived. If Slouching Towards Bethlehem was a warning, the White Album was a confirmation of defeat. It opens with the most famous sentence she ever wrote, a sentence that has been printed on tote bags and coffee mugs by people who fundamentally misunderstand its meaning. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. To the casual reader, this sounds inspirational, an ode to the power of storytelling. But in Didion's hands, it is an indictment. She is saying that the narrative is a lie. We impose a plot line on our lives. I studied hard, so I got the job. We fell in love, so we got married. To hide the terrifying truth that life is actually a series of random, meaningless images. We tell ourselves stories to keep from screaming. In the White Album, Didion admitted that her own story mechanism had broken. She could no longer find the plot. She described a time in the late 60s when she was suffering from vertigo, nausea, and a sense that the world was no longer following the script. In a move of breathtaking vulnerability and arrogance, she included her own psychiatric evaluation in the text of the book. The report describes a patient who is alienated, who sees the world with pessimism, and who has a fragile defense system. Didion published this not to ask for pity, but to show her credentials. She was saying, I am the only one crazy enough to see how crazy you all are. She turned her own nervous breakdown into a lens through which to view the breakdown of the nation. She was the canary in the coal mine, but she had learned to sing about the gas. But while the critics were dissecting her prose, Didion was engaged in a much more dangerous project, raising a child. The relationship between Joan Didion and her adopted daughter, Quintana Roo, is the emotional spine of her biography, a love story fraught with the specific terrors of the neurotic mother. Quintana was a beautiful golden child, a native of the California sun, in a way that Joan never was. Didion loved her with a ferocity that bordered on panic. She was the kind of mother who saw death in every swimming pool, a kidnapper in every shadow. She raised Quintana in the secular temple of their home, surrounded by movie stars, rock gods, and screenwriters. It was a childhood of immense privilege and immense exposure. Quintana was a prop in the Didion mythology, the baby mentioned in the essays, the child whose mending wall Didion was trying to patch up. But there was a haunting quality to this love. Didion wrote about her fears that the viper was always in the cradle. She was trying to protect her daughter from the randomness of the universe, knowing full well that the universe cannot be stopped. She pinned notes to Quintana's dress, she made lists, she packed the emergency kits. She was trying to parent by logistics, hoping that if she was prepared enough, the tragedy would pass over their door. As the 1980s arrived, the Didion-Dunn entity, the two-headed writing beast of Joan and John, needed a new subject. They had exhausted the topic of California culture. The hippies were gone, the movies were corporate, the vibe had flatlined. So Didion turned her dirty eye to a darker, bloodier stage, global politics. In 1982, she traveled to El Salvador. At the time, El Salvador was a slaughterhouse, torn apart by a civil war between a right-wing military junta and leftist guerrillas, with the United States pulling the strings in the background. Most war correspondents went there to report on the bang-bang, the firefights, the troop movements, the body counts. They looked for the story of who was winning. Didion went there and looked for the atmosphere. She landed in San Salvador, not with a flak jacket, but with her signature oversized sunglasses and a skirt. She checked into the Hotel Camino Real, the fortress where the journalists drank away the fear. In her book Salvador, she stripped the war of its ideological pretensions. She didn't write about democracy versus communism. She wrote about the body dumps. She wrote about the way the terror felt in the throat. She described the silence in the shopping malls, the way people wouldn't look you in the eye, the exact angle of light at the Sheraton Hotel where two Americans had been murdered. She treated the Civil War in El Salvador exactly the same way she treated a Hollywood party. She looked for the details that revealed the lie. She noted that the American embassy officials spoke in a language of bureaucratic nonsense, talking about improvement and metrics, while teenagers were being decapitated in the streets. She exposed the absurdity of the American intervention not by arguing policy, but by describing the texture of the fear. She showed that the official story, the story the U.S. government was telling itself to live, was a hallucination. In the jungle, wearing her pearls and holding her notebook, she was more terrifying than the soldiers because she refused to blink. She continued this political dissection with Miami, a book that explored the labyrinth of the Cuban exile community. Again, she ignored the surface narrative and dove into the undercurrents of conspiracy, betrayal, and performance. She saw politics as just another form of show business, a script written by men who believed their own lies. She was proving that her female, domestic, fashion magazine eye was actually the sharpest political instrument in American letters. She understood that in the late 20th century, style was substance. The way a politician wore his suit told you more about his soul than his voting record. By the late 1980s, Joan Didion had become something she likely never intended to be, an institution. She and John Gregory Dunn were the power couple of the bi-coastal elite. They were rich, they were famous. They wrote screenplays for Hollywood studios, A Star is Born, True Confessions, works that they viewed as wages to fund their serious writing. They lived well. They understood the mechanics of the good life, the right table at Morton's, the right temperature for the white wine, the right contractor to fix the roof in Malibu. But the golden dream had become a traffic jam. In 1988, they made the decision to close the circle. They sold the house in Malibu. They packed the Stingray. They moved back to New York City. The return to Manhattan was a triumph. They were no longer the young scrappers trying to make it. They were the lions returning to the den. They settled into a sprawling apartment on the Upper East Side, a place of high ceilings, book-lined walls, and quiet efficiency. They became the center of a new kind of salon. Their dinner parties were legendary, not for the excess, but for the conversation. You went to the Didion Dunn apartment to be tested. You sat at the table, and you had to be sharp. You had to have an opinion on the crisis in the Balkans, the new Scorsese movie, and the layout of the New York Review of Books. And presiding over it all was Joan. She was in her 60s now, the body visibly delicate, but the mind honed to a finer, almost ruthless clarity. She had refined her persona to a sharp point. She was the grand dame of American skepticism. She wrote for the New York Review of Books, filing long, dense essays that dismantled the media narratives of the day. The Central Park Five case, the Clinton impeachment, the endless political conventions. She was the intellectual conscience of the liberal elite, even as she scourged them for their hypocrisy. Life, for a time, seemed to have found a stable rhythm. It was a rhythm of work, dinner, travel, and family. Quintana had grown up. She was married. She was a photographer. The viper in the cradle seemed to have been kept at bay. The mending wall had held. The Didion Dunn Corporation was a well-oiled machine, a partnership so deep that they were functionally one organism. They communicated in a shorthand that no one else could understand. They were safe, or so they told themselves. This is the cruelty of the narrative that Didion had spent her life trying to deconstruct. It waits until you are comfortable, until you think you have mastered the plot, and then it introduces the twist that ruins everything. Didion had spent 50 years preparing for the apocalypse, watching for the snakes, checking the levees, reading the weather reports. She had built a fortress of intelligence and money and fame. She thought she knew where the blow would come from. She thought it would be a fire or a flood or a revolution. She never expected that the apocalypse would start at the dinner table. She never expected that the end of the world would begin with a simple silence in the middle of a sentence. As the millennium turned and the world worried about Y2K and terrorism, Joan Didion was about to enter the great dry season of her heart. The theory of the randomness of life, the theory she had preached in the White Album, the theory she had seen in the eyes of the Manson girls and the soldiers in El Salvador, was about to stop being a theory. It was about to come home. The observer was about to become the victim. The woman who watched the car crash was about to be put inside the car. She had spent a lifetime studying the mechanics of disaster, dissecting it in other countries and other people's lives. But the disaster she was preparing for was theoretical, a political coup, a wildfire, a social collapse. She had fortified her life with intellect and success, believing that if she just paid enough attention, she could see the blow coming. But the narrative she had spent 50 years deconstructing had one final cruel plot twist in store. The apocalypse didn't arrive with a bang or a revolution. It arrived with the quiet clinking of ice in a glass on an ordinary Tuesday night in the safety of her own living room. The date was December 30th, 2003. It is a date that is now etched into the literary consciousness of America, not because of a war or an election, but because of a dinner. Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn were sitting in the living room of their apartment on East 71st Street. The setting was aggressive in its normalcy. It was the week between Christmas and New Year's, that suspended pocket of time when the world feels quiet and domestic. They had just returned from the hospital where their daughter, Quintana Roo, lay in a coma. What had started as a winter flu had mutated with terrifying speed into pneumonia and then septic shock. The viper that Didion had spent her entire life fearing had finally slipped into the cradle. But on this specific night, there was a glimmer of hope. The doctor said Quintana might be stabilizing. Joan and John, exhausted, shell-shocked, but functioning, decided to have dinner. They lit a fire in the grate. Joan poured John a second scotch. She was mixing a salad. They were talking. It was the continuous conversation that had been running for 40 years, the dialogue that was the oxygen of their existence. John was speaking. He was talking about the history of World War I, or perhaps a novel he was reading. And then he stopped. He didn't grab his chest. He didn't scream. He simply fell forward onto the table. In that split second, the universe cleaved in two. Joan Didion, the woman who had trained herself to notice the smallest details, the dirty eye that could spot a fake hemline or a political lie from a mile away, initially thought he was joking. It was a prank. "Don't do that," she said. But the silence that followed was not the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a vacuum. What followed in the next few hours was a masterclass in dissociation. The Vogue training kicked in. The part of her brain that knew how to pack a bag for a war zone, how to edit a sentence, how to organize a shoot, took command of the chaos. She called the paramedics. She noted the time. She cataloged the medical procedures being performed on the living room floor. She registered the scent of ionization from the defibrillator paddles. She rode in the ambulance, sitting in the front seat, holding her purse, looking at the city lights, thinking about the logistics of death. When the doctor at New York Hospital, the same hospital where her daughter was unconscious, told her that John was dead, she didn't collapse. She became a reporter. She asked for the time of death. She asked for his personal effects. She was the cool observer, documenting the end of her own life. She walked out of the hospital into the New York night, a widow, leaving behind the body of the man who had been her editor, her lover, and her shield for 4 decades. She went home to the empty apartment where the fire was still burning and the salad was still unmixed. This is the moment where the magical thinking began. Didion later defined magical thinking as the primitive anthropological belief that our actions can influence outcomes that are physically impossible. It is the logic of the child and the savage. If I don't step on the crack, I won't break my mother's back. If I keep his shoes, he will come back. In the days following John's death, Didion refused to give away his shoes. Her reasoning was not sentimental, it was practical. He would need them if he was to come back. This was not a metaphor. In the deranged, grief-stricken landscape of her mind, the possibility that John Gregory Dunn could walk through the door was a valid variable. She was operating in a parallel dimension where the rules of physics had been suspended by the sheer force of her need. But she couldn't stay in the apartment and mourn. She had a daughter to save. Quintana woke up from her coma just days after her father's funeral, a funeral she missed. Joan had to tell her the news. She had to stand by the hospital bed and explain that the we was now just us. And then in a cruel twist that felt like bad fiction, Quintana collapsed again. She had a hematoma. She needed brain surgery. For the entirety of 2004, Joan Didion lived in what she called the vortex. She was shuttling between the grief of the widow and the terror of the mother. She was walking through the corridors of hospitals in New York, a tiny spectral figure in oversized sunglasses, carrying her notebook. She was reporting on the war inside her own family. She learned the language of the ICU, Glasgow coma scale, intracranial pressure, pulmonary emboli. She treated the doctors like sources, interrogating them, demanding data. She believed that if she could just understand the medical mechanics, she could control the outcome. If she could find the right sentence structure, she could save her daughter. It was out of this crucible that the year of magical thinking was born. She wrote the book in 88 days. It was not a leisurely reflection. It was a purge. It was a survival manual. She didn't write it to heal. She wrote it to stop the screaming. The book is unlike any other memoir of grief because it refuses to be comforting. It is cold, hard, and brilliant. She approached the death of her husband with the same forensic detachment she had used to describe the Manson murders or the war in El Salvador. She analyzed the autopsy report. She analyzed the wave of nausea. She analyzed the specific shade of blue of the hospital curtains. The book became a sensation. It won the National Book Award. It became a bestseller. It was adapted into a Broadway play starring Vanessa Redgrave. Suddenly, Joan Didion, the writer's writer, was a mainstream celebrity. She was the face of grief. People stopped her on the street to tell her about their dead husbands, their lost children. She became a secular saint of mourning. But the tragedy of the year of magical thinking is that it ends on a note of tentative hope. Quintana was alive. She was recovering. The book was a testament to survival. Didion thought she had weathered the storm. She thought the year was over. She was wrong. The narrative was not finished with her. In August 2005, just as the book was about to be published, Quintana Roo Dunn died. She was 39 years old. The cause was acute pancreatitis, a complication of the year-long battle she had fought. This was the blow that broke the levees. Losing a husband is a tragedy, but it is in the natural order of things. We expect to outlive our spouses or for them to outlive us. But losing a child is a violation of the biological contract. It is an event that negates the future. For Didion, it was the ultimate failure. Her entire life as a mother, the packing list, the safety checks, the mending wall had been an effort to prevent this exact moment, and she had failed. The Viper had won. If The Year of Magical Thinking was a book about the madness of grief, her next book, Blue Nights, was a book about the permanence of loss. Blue Nights is a terrifying text. It lacks the frantic energy of magical thinking. It is quieter, sadder, and infinitely more fragile. The title refers to the long twilights of the summer solstice, the blue nights that signal the coming of winter. Didion used it as a metaphor for her own dwindling vitality. She was now alone, truly alone. The Didion Dunn entity was gone. The mother role was gone. She was just Joan, an elderly woman moving carefully through a cavernous apartment filled with the artifacts of a life that no longer existed. In Blue Nights, she turned her dirty eye on herself. She didn't spare herself. She questioned her own parenting. She asked the hard questions. Did she love Quintana too much? Was her anxiety toxic? Did she treat her daughter like a doll or a prop? She wrote about the frailty of old age, the fear of falling on the sidewalk, the fear of the telephone, the fear that she was losing her ability to command the language. She wrote about the fact that she could no longer wear her high heels. It sounds trivial, but for Didion, the loss of the heels was a loss of control. It was an admission that she could no longer stand tall against the world. During the promotional tour for Blue Nights, she looked like a ghost. She was so thin that interviewers were afraid to touch her. Her voice was a whisper. But the mind, the terrifying diamond-hard mind, was still intact. She answered questions with the same elliptical precision, the same refusal to offer easy comfort. When asked if writing the book helped her heal, she said no. Writing didn't heal. It just organized the pain. The late style of Joan Didion was defined by this solitude. She became a symbol of endurance, but an endurance stripped of triumph. She was the last woman standing. She had outlived her husband, her daughter, her peers, her era. She was a piece of the 20th century, stranded in the 21st. And yet, in this final act, she achieved a new kind of cultural relevance. In 2015, the luxury fashion brand Celine famously tapped her as the face of their campaign. The image went viral. Joan Didion, 80 years old, wearing a black sweater and those iconic oversized sunglasses, staring down the camera with a look of absolute, unbothered cool. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to look young. She looked like exactly who she was. A woman who had seen the abyss and decided that she still needed to look chic. To a new generation of millennials and Gen Z readers, she became an icon. They didn't know about the politics of the 70s or the intricacies of the new journalism. They saw a woman who represented mood. They saw the sad girl aesthetic elevated to high art. They resonated with her anxiety, her detachment, her sense that the world was broken. Didion became a meme, a vibe, a patron saint of the disaffected. But behind the sunglasses, the reality was much smaller and much quieter. She spent her days in the apartment on 71st Street. She ate small meals. She read. She watched the news. She kept the shoes. She was living in the aftermath of the explosion, walking through the ruins of her emotional life, cataloging the debris. She knew that the end was coming. She had spent her whole life writing about the ends of things, the end of the 60s, the end of the American dream, the end of the frontier. Now, she was facing the end of the sentence, and true to her nature, she did not look away. She waited. She waited for the final cut, the final edit, the moment when the narrative would simply stop. Yet, as the lights dimmed in her personal life, a strange thing happened. The spotlight of the culture swung back onto her with blinding intensity. As she retreated into the frailty of her physical body, her spectral image began to loom larger than ever over the digital landscape. The woman who had just documented her own disintegration became, improbably, the face of a new generation's anxiety. But while the world was busy turning her into a meme of cool, Joan Didion was busy confronting the final, unanswerable questions of a life spent watching the clock run out. The icon was immortal, but the woman was mortal, and the distance between the two was about to close forever. As Joan Didion entered her final decade, living in the quiet, cavernous rooms on East 71st Street, a strange phenomenon occurred. The culture began to catch up to her paranoia. The world of the 21st century, fragmented, anxious, obsessed with optics, and teetering on the edge of environmental and political collapse, looked increasingly like a Joan Didion paragraph. By the 2010s, the fracture lines she had mapped in the late 1960s were visible every time we opened our phones. She was no longer a prophet of the future. She was the narrator of the present. But with this canonization came the inevitable backlash. To truly understand Didion, we must confront the argument of privilege, the shadow that always trailed her Corvette. Critics, particularly in the later years, began to scrutinize the very detachment that made her famous. They pointed out that her coolness was a luxury item. It is easy to be a detached observer of social collapse when you can retreat to a house in Malibu, order a catered dinner, and fly to Honolulu to get over a migraine. Was she a neurotic aristocrat, aestheticizing the suffering of others? There is a valid argument there. In her essays, the maid is often a background figure. The gardener is a detail of the landscape. She viewed the struggles of the working class through the window of a limousine. She was a Goldwater Republican in her youth, a woman who valued rugged individualism because she had the safety net of a wealthy family in Sacramento to fall back on. She was never a radical. She was a conservative in the truest sense of the word. She wanted to conserve the order of things, and she mourned its loss. However, to dismiss her as an elitist is to miss the point of her art. Didion never claimed to be a woman of the people. She claimed to be a woman with eyes. Her privilege was not a blindfold. It was her perch. It allowed her to access the rooms where the decisions were made, the dinner parties where the lies were fabricated. She was a spy in the house of the establishment. When she dismantled the rhetoric of the political class in Miami or Salvador, she was doing it from the inside. She used her class status as a weapon against her own class. She was the traitor to the country club, the woman who accepted the invitation and then wrote about how the host was spiritually bankrupt. Moreover, her legacy is defined by a rigorous honesty that is almost extinct in modern writing. In an era of oversharing, where every influencer and essayist vomits their trauma onto the internet for validation, Didion's personal writing stands apart because it is not asking for forgiveness or love. It is asking for clarity. When she wrote about her psychiatric evaluation or her failures as a mother, she wasn't doing it to be relatable. She was doing it to be accurate. She treated her own soul as just another piece of data to be fact-checked. She taught a generation of writers that I is not just a pronoun. It is a research subject. As the 2000s bled into the 2000s, Didion's physical presence became ghost-like. She had Parkinson's disease. Her movements, always precise, became tremors. She spoke less and less, but she remained a totem. Young women tattooed her sentences on their ribs. Slouching Towards Bethlehem became a Bible for the anxiety of the Trump era. Everyone wanted to know, what would Joan think of this? But Joan was done thinking for us. She was preparing for the final departure. It is fitting, in a dark, literary way, that she died in December 2021 in the midst of a global pandemic. The world outside her window was masked, fearful, and isolated. A world of social distancing that mirrored the emotional distancing she had practiced her entire life. The bad vibes she had detected in 1969 had become a global virus. The atmosphere was finally as heavy as her prose. She died in her home in her own bed at the age of 87. It was reported as a death from complications of Parkinson's, but in the grand narrative of her life, it felt more like a simple cessation of hostilities. The war was over. The nervousness that had plagued her since she was a child in Sacramento, the humming anxiety that she had transmuted into art, finally went silent. The river she had been running from and running toward finally overtook her. When the news broke, the internet, the very machine of fragmentation she had predicted, flooded with tributes. But amidst the noise there was a profound sense of loss that went beyond the death of a famous writer. We were not just losing a stylist, we were losing a witness. For 60 years, Joan Didion had stood on the balcony, watching the American experiment disintegrate. She had watched the 60s curdle, the 70s rot, the 80s bloat, and the new millennium fragment. She had been the one person we could count on to tell us that the emperor had no clothes, and that the emperor was also depressed. She was the designated driver of the American century, the one who stayed sober to drive us home when the party turned ugly. Now the driver is gone. We are left in the car speeding down the freeway in the dark, with no one to read the map. Her legacy is not just in the books on the shelf, though The Year of Magical Thinking and Slouching Towards Bethlehem will be read as long as the English language exists. Her legacy is in the way we see. Every time we look at a politician and see the performance instead of the policy, we are using Didion's eyes. Every time we feel a sense of dread that we can't name, and we realize it's the Santa Ana wind of the soul, we are using Didion's nerves. She gave us the vocabulary for our own unraveling. The tragedy of her life was that she saw the end coming, and she couldn't stop it. She couldn't save John. She couldn't save Quintana. She couldn't save the America of her childhood. But the triumph of her life was that she wrote it down. She forced the chaos to submit to the sentence. She proved that even if the center cannot hold, the syntax can. In the end, Joan Didion was right. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. She told us the truest, hardest, coldest story of all, that we are fragile, that we are alone, and that the only defense we have against the void is the ability to look at it without blinking. The dirty eye is closed now. The cigarette has burned down to the filter. The Corvette is parked, but the silence she leaves behind is deafening. It is the silence of a truth so pure, it hurts to listen to it. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you can still hear the typing. The sound of a woman trying one last time to get the structure right before the lights go out.